The studio lights blazed hot enough to make sweat bead on anyone's forehead, but Michael Jackson sat perfectly still in the guest chair, his hands folded in his lap, his posture immaculate despite the growing tension in the room. It was February 10th, 1993, and he was about to face one of the most brutal interviews of his entire career on primetime television, broadcast live to 80 million viewers across America. What nobody in that studio knew, not the host, not the crew, not even Michael's own team, was that in exactly 3 minutes, the King of Pop would deliver a response so powerful, so devastatingly honest, that it would transform a moment of public humiliation into one of the most memorable demonstrations of dignity and grace in television history. The show was primetime live on ABC, and sitting across from Michael was Diane Sawyer, one of the most respected and feared journalists in America. She had built her reputation on asking the hard questions, the uncomfortable questions, the questions that made powerful people squirm. And tonight she had Michael Jackson in her crosshairs. The interview had been scheduled for weeks, promoted heavily by the network as an exclusive conversation with the most famous entertainer on the planet. But what Michael's team didn't fully understand was that Diane Sawyer wasn't interested in talking about music or dancing or the upcoming Dangerous World Tour. She wanted answers about the allegations, the rumors, the whispers that had been following Michael for years. Michael wore a black jacket with gold military-style embellishments, his signature style, his hair perfectly styled, his makeup flawless for the cameras. But if you looked closely at his eyes, you could see something that his fans had been seeing more and more lately, a deep weariness, a sadness that no amount of stage presence could fully hide. This was a man who had been the most beloved entertainer in the world, who had broken every record, sold more albums than anyone in history, performed for presidents and royalty. But lately, the media had turned on him with a viciousness that seemed to grow more intense every day. The first 20 minutes of the interview had been uncomfortable, but manageable. Diane asked about his childhood, his relationship with his father, his changing appearance. Michael had answered carefully, his voice soft and measured, choosing his words with the precision of someone who knew that every syllable would be analyzed and dissected by millions of people. He talked about the abuse he suffered from his father during Jackson, 5 rehearsals, the beatings, the psychological torture of being told he was ugly, that his nose was too big. His voice cracked slightly when he described crying himself to sleep as a child, looking in the mirror and hating what he saw. But then Diane Sawyer shifted in her chair, and something in her expression changed. The polite journalist facade fell away, and what replaced it was something harder, more aggressive. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Michael's with an intensity that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that journalists use when they're about to go for the kill, "I want to talk about something that a lot of people are wondering about. There are allegations, rumors that have been circulating for some time now, about your relationship with children." Michael's body went rigid. His hands, which had been resting calmly in his lap, tightened into fists. This was the ambush he'd been dreading. The moment when all the careful preparation and media training would be tested. His security team, watching from the wings, tensed up, ready to intervene if necessary. But Michael raised one hand slightly, a subtle gesture that told them to wait, to let him handle this. "What kind of allegations?" Michael asked quietly, though they both knew exactly what she was talking about. The rumors had started years earlier, whispers that grew louder with each passing month, suggestions that Michael's close friendships with young boys were inappropriate, unnatural, dangerous. The media had been circling this story like sharks sensing blood in the water, and now, on live television in front of 80 million people, Diane Sawyer was going to force Michael to address it directly. Diane didn't hesitate. "There are people who say that your relationships with children, particularly young boys, are inappropriate, that you invite them to Neverland Ranch, that you share your bedroom with them, that there's something wrong with a grown man spending so much time with other people's children." Her words hung in the air like an accusation, and across America, millions of viewers leaned closer to their television screens, waiting to see how Michael Jackson would respond. What happened next was something that nobody expected. Instead of getting defensive, instead of denying everything immediately or attacking the question, Michael Jackson did something that revealed the depth of his pain and the complexity of his character. He looked directly into the camera, past Diane Sawyer, past the studio audience, speaking to every single person watching at home. And when he spoke, His voice carried a vulnerability that was almost unbearable to witness. "I am not going to apologize for loving children," Michael said, and his voice was shaking now, not with fear but with emotion so raw it made the hardened television crew uncomfortable. "I'm not going to apologize for wanting to protect them, for wanting to give them the childhood that I never had. Do you know what it's like to be a child and have no childhood? To be 5 years old and working like an adult? To be beaten and abused and told you're worthless? To look in the mirror and hate yourself because your own father tells you you're ugly?" Diane Sawyer tried to interrupt, to redirect the conversation, but Michael wasn't finished. For years he had been media trained to be careful, to be diplomatic, to never show too much emotion or vulnerability in public. But something had broken inside him, some dam that had been holding back years of pain and frustration and loneliness. And now, live on national television, it all came flooding out. "I look at these children, these beautiful, innocent children, and I see what I lost," Michael continued, tears now visible in his eyes, his voice cracking with emotion. "I see the joy and the wonder that was stolen from me. And yes, I invite them to my ranch. Yes, I play with them and laugh with them and give them experiences that make them happy. Because that's what children deserve. They deserve to be loved and protected and cherished, not exploited and abused and destroyed." The studio had gone completely silent. Camera operators who had filmed thousands of interviews stood frozen, unsure whether to keep rolling or give Michael privacy for this moment of raw vulnerability. Diane Sawyer, who had conducted interviews with presidents and dictators and celebrities, looked genuinely shaken by the intensity of Michael's response. But Michael wasn't done. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so simple and human that it made him seem less like a global superstar and more like a deeply wounded person trying to make sense of a cruel world. "You want to know what's inappropriate?" Michael asked, his voice gaining strength now. "What's inappropriate is living in a world where showing love to children is considered suspicious. What's inappropriate is that we've become so cynical, so damaged, that we can't imagine someone caring about kids without there being some sinister motive behind it." He stood up from his chair, and for a moment it looked like he might walk off the set. His handlers rushed forward, but Michael waved them back. He wasn't leaving, he was just too emotional to sit still anymore. "I have sleepovers at Neverland," Michael said, pacing now, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. "Families come, children come, and yes, sometimes kids sleep in my room. Do you know why? Because my room is 2 stories. It has a living area, it has beds, it's like a small apartment. And these kids, they're having the time of their lives, they're safe, they're protected, and their parents are there. Their parents know exactly what's happening." Diane Sawyer found her voice again. "But Michael, surely you can understand why people find this concerning. You're a grown man. You're one of the most famous people in the world, and you're spending nights with children who aren't your own." Michael stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. What he said next would become one of the most quoted moments of his entire career, a statement that revealed both his innocence and his inability to fully understand how his behavior appeared to others. If there was something wrong with it, why would the parents let their children come? Why would they trust me? "I'll tell you why. Because they know me. They know my heart. They know that I would die before I let anything bad happen to one of those kids." The emotion in the studio was overwhelming now. Some of the crew members had tears in their eyes. Diane Sawyer, despite her journalistic training, looked genuinely moved by Michael's passion and pain. But she had one more question, one more knife to twist. "Michael, there are people who say that this is a pattern, that you seek out vulnerable children, that you use your fame and your money to manipulate families." That's when Michael Jackson did something that nobody expected. Instead of continuing to defend himself, instead of arguing or explaining or justifying, he changed tactics completely. He sat back down in his chair, composed himself, and looked directly at Diane Sawyer with an expression of such profound sadness that it was almost unbearable to witness. "Let me tell you about a boy I know," Michael said quietly. "His name is Ryan White. He had AIDS. Back in the 1980s, when people with AIDS were treated like monsters, when children with the disease were kicked out of schools and rejected by their communities, I met Ryan. He was scared and alone and dying, and nobody wanted to be near him because they were afraid of catching the disease." Michael's voice was steady now, no longer shaking with emotion, but filled with a quiet dignity that commanded attention. I didn't care about the risk. I didn't care what people said. I held Ryan's hand. I hugged him. I told him he mattered, that he was loved, that his life had value. I paid for his medical treatments. I visited him in the hospital, and when he died, I cried at his funeral because I had lost a friend, a beautiful soul who deserved so much better than what this world gave him. The camera was tight on Michael's face now, capturing every flicker of emotion, every nuance of expression. "That's who I am," Michael said. "I'm the person who sees suffering and wants to help. I'm the person who sees children in pain and wants to protect them. I'm the person who remembers what it's like to be powerless and afraid and alone. And if the world wants to turn that into something ugly and suspicious, then I can't stop them. But I'm not going to change who I am. I'm not going to stop loving children. I'm not going to stop trying to make the world a better place just because cynical people can't understand pure intentions." Diane Sawyer tried to regain control of the interview, to steer it back to safer territory, but something fundamental had shifted in the studio. This was no longer an interrogation. This had become something else entirely, a moment of raw human truth that transcended the typical celebrity interview format. Michael Jackson had been cornered, attacked, humiliated on live television in front of 80 million people. And instead of fighting back with anger or arrogance, he had responded with a vulnerability and honesty that was almost painful to witness. "I want to show you something," Michael said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a photograph, worn and creased from being carried everywhere he went. It showed Michael surrounded by children at Neverland Ranch, all of them laughing, their faces lit up with genuine joy. "This is what I care about," Michael said, holding the photo up to the camera. "This moment right here. These kids weren't thinking about my fame or my money. They were just being children, experiencing joy and wonder and magic. That's what I live for. That's what makes all the pain and the accusations and the cruelty worth it." He stood up again, but this time with purpose, with dignity restored. "Diane, you asked me about inappropriate relationships with children. Let me tell you what's truly inappropriate. It's inappropriate that we live in a world where Michael Jackson, who has given millions of dollars to children's charities, who has visited sick kids in hospitals around the world, who has used his platform to fight for children's rights, is sitting here being treated like a criminal for showing love and compassion. It's inappropriate that we've become so damaged as a society that we can't recognize genuine kindness when we see it." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but nothing Diane Sawyer asked could match the intensity of those 3 minutes when Michael Jackson had laid his soul bare in front of the world. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the studio audience sat in stunned silence. Some were crying. Others looked shell-shocked, as if they just witnessed something profound and transformative that they couldn't quite process. In the control room, the producers were frantically discussing what they'd just captured. This wasn't the interview they'd planned. They had expected defensive denials, maybe some rehearsed answers crafted by lawyers and PR teams. Instead, they had captured something real, something raw, something that would be talked about for decades to come. Michael's team rushed to him as soon as the interview ended. His manager was furious, convinced that Michael's emotional vulnerability had been a mistake, that he should have stuck to carefully prepared statements, but Michael just shook his head tiredly. "I told the truth," he said simply. "That's all I can do." The response to the interview was immediate and overwhelming. Phone lines at ABC were flooded with calls from viewers who had been moved to tears by Michael's honesty. Letters poured into the network, thousands of them, from parents who said they finally understood what Michael was trying to do, from abuse survivors who recognized their own pain in his words, from people who had judged him harshly but now felt ashamed of their assumptions. But not everyone was convinced. Critics argued that Michael's emotional response was manipulative, that he was playing on people's sympathies to deflect from legitimate questions about his behavior. The tabloids doubled down on their coverage, spinning the interview as evidence of instability rather than honesty, and the allegations, the whispers, the rumors continued to grow, eventually culminating in accusations that would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. Looking back now, years after Michael Jackson's death, that interview with Diane Sawyer takes on even greater significance. It was a moment when one of the most famous people in the world stood before millions of viewers and showed them his wounds, his pain, his desperate need to be understood. Whether you believed him or not, Whether you thought his behavior with children was appropriate or concerning, there was no denying the raw authenticity of his emotion in that moment. Michael Jackson was humiliated on live television, attacked and accused in front of 80 million people, and his response, those 3 minutes of devastating honesty, revealed something essential about who he was: a deeply damaged person trying to heal himself by protecting others, a wounded child in an adult's body reaching out to other children because they were the only ones who didn't judge him, didn't want anything from him except his friendship and his magic. The tragedy is that the world couldn't see it, or maybe the world saw it and couldn't accept it because it was too painful, too complicated, too far outside the normal boundaries of how adults are supposed to behave. Michael Jackson wanted to give children the childhood he never had, and the price he paid for that desire was a lifetime of suspicion, accusation, and ultimately a loneliness so profound that it may have contributed to his early death. That interview didn't save Michael Jackson's reputation. If anything, it marked the beginning of a downward spiral that would eventually destroy him. But it did show the world something important, that even the king of pop, even the most famous entertainer who ever lived, was just a human being trying to make sense of his pain and find some meaning in his suffering. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when you know the world isn't ready to hear it.